Hello, everyone. This is True Machiavello, and I'm with Primo Magazine. Today is November 30th, and I'm coming to you again, as always, from Washington, D.C. And happy Thanksgiving, and happy Black Friday, and we're on the way to Christmas time, and we have to go out there and get our gifts and get them wrapped and get the tree and get the decorations. And it's just going to be a great time for all of us. So I want to wish you all a Merry Christmas. I'll probably wish you a few Merry Christmases as I have more videos coming your way. And I want to thank you for tuning in. Please like this video and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. I continue the conversation that we've begun on Machiavelli and the Presidents. Niccolo Machiavelli, author of The Prince and a number of other writings from Florence and Tuscany during the time of the Renaissance. And we're talking about his view, if you're alive today, and from what we can read from The Prince, his view of the presidents, in particular the five presidents between Dwight David Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan from 1961 to 1981. We had five presidents of the United States: John F. Kennedy, right? Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. And what they all have in common is that they did not complete two terms in office. It's customary for a president to win election and win re-election and serve 8 years, but these presidents, none of them were able to serve 8 years. In Kennedy's case, was our first episode. He died from an assassination, so he was like 2 years into his presidency, and he was killed. And then Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was vice president, took over, and he served until 1969, 6 years, and then he refused to run again, refused to run for re-election. And then today's topic, Richard M. Nixon, he served from 1969 until 1974. And he was elected, very close election in 1968. And then he ran for re-election in 1972, won a huge landslide. But 2 years later, he had to resign. And then Gerald Ford took his place and for a couple of years. And then he ran for re-election, but he lost to Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter then became the president. And he ran for re-election but lost to Ronald Reagan. So all of these presidents have one thing in common: they couldn't complete two terms. They lost power. And this brings up the notion of Machiavelli. What would Machiavelli see in them? What can we learn from their presidencies? What did they do or what they didn't do, according to Machiavelli? Niccolo Machiavelli, he wrote The Prince, and basically, in his mind, it was power. And the goal was to hold on to power as long as you could. He felt then, and really throughout all of politics, that power was the best thing for you, if you were the leader, for your supporters, and for your country, because it was stability. That's what he wanted, was stability. He looked at the Roman Republic, and he saw that societies were fragile. And that was important that you kept the leader in position, or that he kept himself, by utilizing the ideas that Machiavelli had based upon his study of history and then his work in the government of Florence for almost 20 years. So he visited all kinds of city-states all over the place in Italy. He went up to visit the King of France. He was the emissary for the Florentine kingdom. So he just knew all there was about politics. And here he was, a trained lawyer, master of history, and he said none of this applied in the political realm. It was the sandbox. It was the street fight. It was a crude setting that you had to master. And so using this notion, we looked at the first episode, which was JFK, John F. Kennedy, his assassination. We had to accept the theory of conspiracy, the idea that a group within the government, a group within the security arrangement, had conspired and killed the president. And this was something that was not uncommon in Machiavelli's time. Many leaders were killed. Poison was the was the method back then, but it wasn't unusual for someone to be stabbed or killed with some sort of weapon. And it didn't, most often you didn't know who the assassin was, or you knew that there was a power change. And quite often the reason why a person was killed, a leader was killed or assassinated or quickly deposed, was because he had lost the war. He was losing battles. He was seen as weak. And this led us to the second episode, which was Lyndon Baines Johnson. And in that, I had two sins that LBJ had committed in the eyes of Machiavelli. One was that he gave everything away. He was just very he was very willing to pass legislation, help the poor and the needy, and this was all good. But he did so much that they didn't need him anymore, and they turned on him, and they turned on his presidency, and he lost power. And that was also a lesson for Machiavelli. Machiavelli said it's better to be more miserly than it is to be more liberal. Liberal in the generic sense, where you're giving things out, giving the treasure of the government. But the second reason why he also failed, and I didn't really go into too much detail about that, and I want to try to make up for it right now, was the fact that he lost the war in Vietnam, or he was perceived losing the war in Vietnam. And when that happens, Machiavelli says you're tied to your general. You know, if you're the prince or the president, you and your generals go hand in hand. Their failures become your failures. So in the case of Vietnam, if you had somebody like General Westmoreland, who was failing to decisively win the war, then you would need to fire him. So if you're LBJ, you would probably would want to fire Westmoreland and put somebody else in. However, if you don't want to do that, then what you have to do, if you're the prince, in this case the president, you have to win the war in spite of the general. You have to do the general's job and win the war. That's very important. And so in this case, what Machiavelli had advised was that the whoever was going to be the prince needed to know all there was about warfare. He had to be a hunter so that he would learn the territory. He had to be a master of weaponries and tactics, because if the generals are not winning the battles, then you have to tell the generals how to win the battles. And this is what Lincoln did. If you go back to the Civil War, he was actually telling the generals how to fight because they were making some serious mistakes in his mind. And it wasn't until he discovered Ulysses S. Grant that he didn't have to be as engaged as he was before. But if you go back and look at photographs from the Civil War, you will see Lincoln visiting all the battlefronts, you know, pretty much many of the places, because he was trying to get a feel for the territory, a feel for what was going on, so he could then convey orders to the generals. You can't risk a general, no matter how qualified he or she is, losing the war. When you lose the war, you're seen as weak. And when you're seen as weak, people on your own side will come after you. And this is what happened with LBJ and some of the other things he did. Well, in today's topic, Richard Nixon, he inherited the Vietnam War from LBJ, and he fought the war differently than Johnson. Nixon tended to focus on the air power, the Air Force. Now, LBJ also had the Rolling Thunder situation where a number of B-52s and other aircraft were bombing Vietnam. But in Nixon's case, what he did differently than LBJ was he targeted the bombing in a bunch of places. And so he was more effective. And he was able to get the North Vietnamese, the communist area of Vietnam, to come to the table and sit and talk and make the peace. And that was what he campaigned on. He promised the United States that he would get us out of Vietnam with honor. And he kind of did that. But you can see the difference between how the war was fought between LBJ and Nixon. Nixon was more decisive, more willing to destroy the enemy's key installations, the factories, the trains, the ports, all kinds of things. And that's kind of what he did. And that's how he was able to get the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table and make it the treaty, make the peace. What was interesting about Nixon was his presidency. He ran in '68, very close election, barely won. He barely lost when he first ran for president in 1960. And here he was the vice president under Dwight David Eisenhower. He had been the senator, he had been a congressman. He knew all there was about the government. And then when the time came to run, he lost a squeaker of an election to John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy had the money, had the charisma, and Nixon lost. And then 2 years later, he ran as governor of California, and he lost that race. So people thought he was, gone. He was out to pasture. His political life was finished. But he came roaring back. He campaigned on his own. He helped the Republicans in a number of elections. And so in 1968, he was the nominee. LBJ had bowed out by then, and he won a squeaker election. And then 4 years later, he won a huge landslide, 1972. I mean, you're talking about an election victory, one of the biggest in American history. He won 520 electoral votes to 17 against a war hero, George McGovern. Quite amazing. And 2 years later, though, he is out. He resigns from office because of the Watergate scandal. Now, what happened there, and what happened to Nixon? Nixon, if Machiavelli was alive, probably he would have admired Nixon as president more than any of the other presidents we talk about. Nixon did pretty much everything he was supposed to do as a strong leader, and he was a powerful, strong leader for a number of years. What he did was what Machiavelli advises. You have the government, you have the presentation of government, right? But you don't work it that way. You don't get things done by going through the channels that have been created in a republic or created anywhere, because they are too bureaucratic, they're too convoluted, there are too many people involved. It's hard to get things done. So what Machiavelli advised was for you to have a group of advisors, a group of men and women who are capable, smart, and loyal to you, and they would advise you, but they would also get things done for you if you were the prince or the president. And this is what Nixon did. Nixon had a group of men that were always there with him most of the time in the White House, and they were the ones who would carry out his orders. And quite often, as Machiavelli advises, do it in secret. And this is what he did in foreign policy. In the last episode, we talked about how LBJ was a master of domestic policy. Well, Nixon was a master of foreign policy, but how he got things done was his national security advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger. He sent him out for important diplomatic peace missions. He was the one, Kissinger, who got the North Vietnamese to come back to the negotiating table to broker an end to the war. It was in secret Kissinger who went to China to make the arrangements so that Nixon could then fly to China and meet with Mao Zedong and the leaders of China and open up this incredible diplomatic, economic relationship we've had since then. And this was all done behind the scenes. Nixon didn't go through the State Department. He didn't go through regular diplomatic channels. He had his advisor do it, and secret, not to let the press know, not to let the bureaucracy know. Nixon hated the bureaucracy, he said. Nixon was the classic Republican in that way. He was an efficiency guru. He was somebody who wanted to get things done in an efficient way and didn't like he wasn't against central planning, mind you, or central government. He just didn't like the size it was and the cumbersome challenges that it faced. He wanted to, get things done quickly, succinctly, under his control. And then he went beyond that from foreign policy. He had his close advisors who advised him domestically, take it one step further. And what further was to actually go out and spy on people and provide provocation tactics, to break in to a psychiatrist's office to get a file on whom they thought was interfering in the sanctity of the diplomatic realm, which was Daniel Ellsberg had done this. And they were going to sneak into a psychiatrist's office and get his file. They did other things like that. He was given the nickname Tricky Dick because he was always up to dirty tricks, they said. But this was not unusual, except in Nixon's case, He didn't have somebody in the FBI do it for him, maybe somebody in the police forces, somebody in the security agencies do it for him, or in the Central Intelligence Agency. He did it on his own, with his own advisors doing it. And this made him unique. This gave him some trouble. This is what led to Watergate. It was his advisors, the people working in the White House, who wanted to sneak in through the Watergate complex, the apartment building and office complex there in Washington, D.C., and try to dig dirt, if you will, or damning information on the Democrats. Now, that's an interesting thing. It's brought up as a bumbling burglary, Watergate, and this eventually brought down Nixon. But as many people are beginning to look at it in more detail with podcasting available, we're beginning to see that maybe it wasn't so much this bumbling burglary. Maybe it was a setup, and it was a setup by an organization that Machiavelli would also admire, and that was probably the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA and the Nixon administration would be two groups that Machiavelli would admire and endorse and agree with. And when I say the CIA, you could also probably include the FBI, the National Security Council, whatever. Machiavelli saw society as fragile. And when you had something good like a republic, you wanted to keep it. But in order to have a republic, you have to allow people freedom to assemble, freedom to speak, freedom to exchange ideas, all good. But you don't want those ideas to be acted upon when they can destroy the country, when they can destroy the city-state. So this is why Machiavelli would endorse something like the CIA, who's out there with their own propaganda, able to infiltrate the news media, academia, able to do a number of special operations in secret. Machiavelli was fond of secrecy. You have a government and you want it to be considered noble and virtuous, but you know things can't get done that way. So you have to have something like the Central Intelligence Agency that goes through back channels, that works in secrecy, that connives, conspires, in order to keep the society, in order to keep the republic. When we hear about what they do, when we hear about how they did it, we might not like it. But the end game is correct. And that's how Machiavelli saw it. He's credited with the term, the ends justify the means. I don't think he wrote that or said that, but that would be a correct way to look at it. And when you look at Watergate, you see that the people who actually broke in to the Watergate complex, they were all either former members of the Central Intelligence Agency or they were currently working. Now, when you retire from the CIA, does that mean you're cut off from all connections? No, you probably have some connections that are there. Some have said that the police force here in Washington, D.C. had members working on the payroll for the Central Intelligence Agency. This was the second time, by the way, that this group, and they were called the Plumbers, to protect the White House from leaks. This was the second time they had broken into Watergate. But somehow they had keys and everything, and yet they taped the door so that the security guard could catch them. Basically, what had happened was, what a lot of people believe, was that Nixon was doing things that the CIA should have been doing. Nixon's administration, they're conniving, they're sneaking, they're breaking and entering. They were doing things, the surveillance activity, for instance. They're tapping phones and other things. This was something that the CIA should have been doing, or the FBI was doing. They were moving in that territory. And this alienated and this angered people within the Central Intelligence Agency and within the security apparatus. And so you had this conflict. And the theory is that when the time came for Watergate, the CIA was going to set up Nixon for the purpose of just embarrassing him. Sending a message to him, if you're going to do this, let us do it. Get out of our territory. This isn't for you, basically. But what happened was, it was a snowballing effect. And it led to his resignation. Now, what's the snowballing effect about? How does that relate to Machiavelli? Well, Machiavelli says for you to maintain power, for you to stay in power, you got to do three things. You got to get the people to fear you. You got to get them to respect you. And you got to get them to like you. And when he says like, he means the people and the nobility. Now, in Nixon's case, the people were all supportive of him. He won a huge landslide victory when he ran for re-election in 1972. But what about the nobility? What about the people in power? People in power here in Washington, in the legislature, in the bureaucracy, and in the media, especially. Well, they hated him. And Machiavelli says if you have two groups, it's better to have the nobility like you than it is to say to have the people. And the nobility didn't like Nixon for a number of reasons. Nixon was not unlike Trump in some ways. He tended to tell you like it is, basically. He tended to speak out. He was brash in some ways. He was in some ways, if you go back and see how he talks, he doesn't, not the same style as Trump, not the same, rapid speaking, but he seemed very confident in what he said, opinionated in what he said. And quite often that was against what a lot of people thought should be done. He ran afoul of what he said was the Eastern establishment, the people who graduated from the Ivy League schools in particular. He came from California, a different place. He was very smart, very bright. And he actually had at one point in time a scholarship to Harvard, but he didn't go because his family had problems in Whittier. His brother was dying, so he decided to stay home. But he felt like he was never accepted in this society. And here was a man who was powerful, who was rising up in the ranks. He took down one of the bright spots of the Eastern establishment, Alger Hiss. He proved that Alger Hiss was a communist when he first started out. And Alger Hiss was actually advising Franklin Roosevelt in World War II. And this angered a lot of people. But Nixon once said in an interview that he thought he had maybe 75% of the people, get this, in the media, hated him. And about 50% of the people in Congress hated him. I guess you would probably say an equal amount of in the legislature. Not dislike or not, ambivalence, hatred. And this is what he was running up against. So this was a flaw in his grasp for power and his maintenance of power. He actually had in the White House an enemies list. It was in writing with photographs and everything else. And that was leaked to the press. When people found out about it, they were obviously outraged. There was some evidence to suggest that he was using the government to get back at these people. Machiavelli would say never to do something like that. Machiavelli was in favor of you neutralizing your enemies, but you didn't do it. You didn't put it in writing. You did it. You kept it to yourself. And when the moment arose to you to neutralize your enemy, you went ahead and did that. But you wouldn't publicize it. You wouldn't make a book out of it. You wouldn't let it be in a place where it could be publicized. When that happened, and when people had the opportunity that they did with Watergate, they took advantage of that, and that was going to bring him down. Now, what Machiavelli would have said would be, look, if you have enemies, and have that many enemies, you need to find a way to neutralize them. And there's more of them than there are of you. So what he would have suggested would be for you to reach out to some of them, maybe to divide them, pick a group that you think are reachable, get them to come in to the White House, perhaps, give them a one-on-one interviews, try to make friends with those people, try to flatter them, and try to divide and conquer who your group of enemies are. When the Daniel Ellsberg situation broke, this was somebody who worked at the Pentagon. He had paperwork that showed that LBJ was not necessarily honest with the American people about Vietnam, and this made it all through the newspapers. Nixon tried to stop it, and he tried to stop it by attacking the press. And yet this was damning material for LBJ. But by the way he did it, so aggressive, so abrupt, this caused friction within a group. He had enemies listed as Hollywood actors, reporters, writers, people in Congress. You're sending a message that if you think these people are your enemy, then they think you're their enemy. And you could be a threat to them. So they're going to team up against you and take you down. And this is what they did. this is what they did. You can't fight the world. That's the thing. You got to pick and choose your fights. You have to be very strategic. Machiavelli says you have to be a lion and a fox. And in Nixon's case, he was a lion. He really was. He was very proactive. He was decisive. They got him on conspiracy, which was kind of strange, because when the Watergate burglary broke out in the press, and the 5 men or so, they're all tied to the CIA, were arrested, indicted. He tried to get them legal counsel, and the FBI wanted to investigate that they might have been tied to the campaign to re-elect Nixon. And he tried to make up an idea that it was the CIA. It was a CIA operation. Now, why would he do that, do you think? Well, my feeling is maybe he knew that the CIA might have been involved to begin with. But when the FBI contacted Richard Helms, the leader of the CIA, there was an argument about it, and it was brought back to Nixon. Nixon said, let the investigation proceed as is. So he conspired to obstruct justice maybe one day. One day alone. And he backtracked on it. But apparently that was enough to get him. So he was told that they're going to impeach him. The Congress was loaded with Democrats, many of whom hated him, and many of whom he thought they were his enemies. They were part of his enemies list. And he was going to get impeached, and he was going to get removed. He didn't have the votes. It's unlike what we see with Trump. He got impeached twice, but he had the Republicans in Congress to stop him from being removed from office. That wasn't the case with Nixon. So Nixon had to resign. And he resigned in 1974 in August. He was somebody who was at the peak of power and was brought down. Nixon is one of these characters that, one of these presidents, when you're young, when you're in college, you don't like him at all because you hear so many bad things about him. But then as you get older, you realize, well, people say a lot of bad things about a lot of people, don't they? But, you know, what's true, what's not. And so therefore you can then reapproach him. And when you do, you realize he was quite a good president. He did a lot of good for the country. His vision for the country, really, is kind of what we see today. The United States is a global country. Nixon was confident that it was the international relations we would have in all facets, you know, not just in the military, not just in trade, culture, everything would be the future. And he's kind of right about that. The United States today really is a global country. We have so many cities that are international cities now. And that came from Nixon just brokering deals, brokering arrangements with countries that we really didn't have too many relationships before, all parts of Asia and the Middle East, elsewhere. His trip to China was enormously historic. And what China's like today, the relations we have with them, you can trace it all the way back to Nixon. Quite extraordinary. And the Middle East. He was a supporter of Israel, but he also made serious connections with the Arab world and the oil that was there. He had set his sights on Brazil and South America, but he had resigned before that happened. But he was somebody who really saw that our future was going to be tied to how we dealt with other countries. And with that, you could utilize that and negotiate one against the other for purposes of keeping the peace. And this is what he did with China. He was able to go back to the Soviet Union and negotiate with them and say, hey, look, if you don't agree with some of the things I want, I'll go with your rival here in Asia. And he used his relationship with China to also pressure on North Vietnam to get back to the peace table. And that's the kind of guy he was. And he was very decisive. He doesn't look that way because, you know, he's got these jowly face and he talks, kind of stammers a little bit, but when they show him what he spoke on the phones, and quite often they try to embarrass him by it by showing him curse and say terrible things, there are moments when he will decisively say to the military, you have to do this, and decisively say to this guy, you must do that. And this is right up Machiavelli's alley. The leader had to be decisive. He had to be strong. He had to be tough. Nixon was all those qualities, but he had too many enemies. That was the problem. He didn't neutralize his enemies with not a stick, but with a carrot, you know? Try to make it better. Maybe it wouldn't work exactly the way he wanted it to, but maybe it would have worked better. I think once Watergate took off, he was doomed. No matter what he would have done, they would have got him because they hated him that much. And it's not good to be hated like that. You have to. A leader has to be loved. He has to be liked by everyone, and particularly by the noble classes. That wasn't the case with Nixon. So that brought him down. There you have it. Richard Nixon, Machiavelli, an extraordinary president. And the next episode, we're going to look at the person who took his place, which was Gerald Ford, who was also kind of a character. And what happened with him, and why did he only last for 2 years? We'll talk about that next episode. But there you go, Richard Nixon. He's the third of our 5 presidents that we're looking at in the eyes of Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli in his book, The Prince. Quite extraordinary. Anyway, I want to thank you for tuning in. Please like this video if you do, and please subscribe to our channel. And please check out our website at www.onlineprimo.com. There's a lot of great articles there. We have a new edition that's there. You can view it digitally. It's really quite fantastic. On the covers, Claudia Cardinale, beautiful woman, and a great actress. And we look at a lot of her work. But anyway, I want to thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon. Until then, all the best.